Sometimes life beats a man down so hard, he forgets what he's capable of. That's what happened to Elias Boone, a widowed cowboy who arrived in Dead Hollow with nothing but broken boots and shattered spirit. When an old rancher gave him a stubborn donkey named Maisie, the town erupted in laughter. They mocked him. What kind of cowboy rides a donkey? But when outlaws kidnapped the rancher's granddaughter and escaped into canyon country where no horse could follow, something remarkable happened. While others stood helpless, Elias saddled up Maisie and disappeared into wilderness. What happened? Next would silence every person who laughed at the broken cowboy and donkey. Could an old donkey and man accomplish what town believed impossible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust cloud that followed Elias Boone into Dead Hollow that September morning seemed to carry more than just the grit of 100 miles of hard road. It carried the weight of a man who had lost everything that mattered and found himself walking because he no longer owned a horse worth riding. His boots, split at the seams and held together with leather strips cut from what remained of his belt, scraped against the wooden planks of Main Street. Each step sent small puffs of dust through the gaps, and with every footfall came the soft jingle of spurs he couldn't bring himself to remove. They had been Sarah's wedding gift to him, silver-plated with his initials etched along the sides, and though they served no purpose on a man without a horse, they were all he had left of the life he'd built and lost. Dead Hollow earned its name honestly. Built in the crook of a dry creek bed that hadn't seen water in living memory, the town squatted under the merciless September sun, like something that had crawled there to die. The buildings, weathered grey by wind and heat, lined both sides of a street that was more hope than reality. Most structures leaned against each other for support, their wooden siding cracked and warped, while hand-painted signs advertised services that seemed more wishful than factual. The general store occupied the largest building, its false front reaching 2 stories high to suggest prosperity that didn't extend beyond the facade. Next to it, the saloon's batwing doors hung slightly askew, one hinge bent from some long-forgotten altercation. A barber shop, a small bank that looked as though it hadn't seen a deposit in months, and various other enterprises completed the modest collection of commerce that kept Dead Hollow from disappearing entirely into the vast emptiness of the territory. But it was the people Elias noticed most. They moved with the particular caution of folks who had learned to be suspicious of strangers, especially strangers who arrived on foot with nothing but the clothes on their backs and eyes that had seen too much. Men paused in their conversations to watch him pass. Women gathered their children closer. The few horses tied to hitching posts shifted restlessly, as though sensing something in his manner that made them nervous. Elias had grown accustomed to such reactions over the weeks since. He'd left what remained of his ranch in Colorado. He understood what people saw when they looked at him. A man past 40, with graying temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of sorrows too heavy for his years. His shirt, once white, had faded to the color of old bone. His vest, dark leather, worn smooth in places, hung loose on a frame that had carried more weight in better times. The gun belt around his waist held a Colt .45 that looked well-maintained, despite everything else about him suggesting neglect. Most telling of all was the gold band on his left hand, still bright despite everything he'd lost. He caught people's eyes drifting to it, trying to reconcile the presence of a wedding ring with the obvious absence of a wife. Some looked away quickly, understanding enough about loss to respect the pain they glimpsed. Others stared longer, perhaps wondering what kind of man kept wearing a ring when its purpose had ended. Frank Hendricks noticed the ring too, though he tried to be subtle about it. The old rancher sat on the porch of the general store, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 72, Frank had seen enough of life to recognize a man carrying ghosts, and something in Elias Boone's careful way of moving suggested those ghosts were recent and heavy. "You're traveling light, friend," Frank said, as Elias paused near the store's steps. His voice carried the measured cadence of a man who had learned when to speak and when to listen. Elias looked up, squinting against the afternoon glare. "Light enough," he replied. His voice carried traces of education beneath the roughness of recent hard living. "Looking for work, if there's any to be found." Frank studied him for a long moment, taking in the worn clothes and tired eyes, but also noticing the straight way the stranger held himself and the careful attention he paid to his surroundings. These were not the habits of a drifter or a man running from the law. They were the instincts of someone who had learned to be cautious through experience rather than guilt. "Work's scarce around here," Frank said finally. "Most folks can barely keep themselves fed, let alone hire help." He paused, then gestured toward the empty street. "But you're welcome to try. Name's Frank Hendricks. I run a small spread about 5 miles north of town. Elias Boone." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Much obliged for the courtesy." Something in the way he introduced himself, with that particular formality men of their generation used when circumstances required proper introductions, told Frank that Elias Boone had once been a man of some standing. The careful pronunciation, the slight bow of his head, the instinctive respect shown to an elder, these were habits learned in better circumstances and maintained despite current hardship. "You're from Colorado, judging by your voice," Frank observed. Elias nodded. "Had a small ranch outside Durango. Weather took the cattle, bank took the land." He said it simply, without self-pity or blame, the way a man might describe a change in the wind. Frank understood that tone. He had heard it from other men who had learned that some losses were too large for emotion and required the kind of stark acceptance that came only after fighting a battle until there was nothing left to fight with. "I'm sorry for your troubles," he said, and meant it. "Obliged." Elias adjusted the small bundle of possessions slung over his shoulder. "I should let you get back to your evening. Just wanted to introduce myself proper-like." He turned to continue down the street, but Frank's voice stopped him. "Boone, you said? You wouldn't happen to be the Elias Boone who served with the 4th Cavalry?" Elias turned back slowly, wariness replacing the polite distance in his expression. "Might be. Depends on who's asking and why." Frank smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Elias had seen since arriving in Dead Hollow. "Because if you are, then you're the fellow who held off 24 Apache warriors at Red Canyon long enough for a supply train to get through. My nephew was driving one of those wagons." The recognition hit Elias like a physical blow, though. He tried not to show it. Those were memories from another lifetime, when he had worn blue wool instead of worn cotton, and carried orders from men who trusted him with lives and missions that mattered. When he had been somebody whose actions could change outcomes, and whose word carried weight beyond his immediate circumstances. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Not so long that a man forgets," Frank replied. "Tommy used to tell that story every time he came through here. Said there was this sergeant who kept them alive through the worst night of his life, calm as you please, like he was directing Sunday choir practice instead of a fighting retreat through hostile territory." Elias felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone connected him to the man he used to be. It was not entirely unpleasant, but it carried with it the weight of expectations he no longer felt capable of meeting. "I was just doing my job," he said. "Maybe," Frank agreed. "But Tommy made it home to his wife and children because you did that job better than most would have." He stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "You say you're looking for work?" "Yes, sir." Frank walked to the edge of the porch and pointed toward a small corral visible behind the general store. "See that old donkey over there? The gray one with the white nose?" Elias followed his gaze to where a sturdy donkey stood in the shade of a lean-to shelter. Even from a distance, he could see the animal's patient stance and the careful way she positioned herself to take advantage of what little breeze stirred the evening air. Her coat was dusty, but appeared well-maintained, and there was something in her bearing that suggested intelligence and stubborn dignity. That's Maisie, Frank continued. She's been with me for 8 years, ever since I found her wandering loose after a flash flood took out a freight operation up in the hills. Good worker, sure-footed as they come, but she's got more sense than most horses, and twice the stubbornness of any mule. He paused, studying Elias's reaction. The thing is, my granddaughter Emma's been after me to find Maisie a proper job. Says it's not fair for an animal that good to spend her days just standing around eating my hay. Elias sensed there was more, and to this conversation, than a simple job offer. What kind of work did you have in mind? Frank smiled again, but this time there was something calculating in his expression. Well now, that depends. You know anything about packing supplies, hauling small loads, that sort of thing? There's folks around here who need things moved but can't afford a full freight operation. Maisie could handle that kind of work, but she'd need someone who understands animals and isn't too proud to travel at donkey speed instead of horse speed. The offer hung in the air between them while Elias considered its implications. Work was work, and he was in no position to be particular about the specifics. But he also understood that Frank Hendricks was offering him more than just employment. He was offering a chance to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond simply surviving until the next sunset. I've worked with animals before, Elias said carefully. Horses mostly, but I understand mules and donkeys well enough. Good, Frank nodded toward the corral. Why don't you go introduce yourself to Maisie? See how you two get along. If she takes to you, we can work out the details tomorrow. As Elias walked toward the corral, he was aware of eyes watching from doorways and windows. Word traveled fast. In a town the size of Dead Hollow, and by now everyone would know about the stranger who had arrived on foot and was being offered work by Frank Hendricks. He could imagine the conversations already beginning. The speculation about what kind of man lost everything and ended up walking into their dusty corner of nowhere. Maisie watched his approach with the steady attention of an animal accustomed to evaluating humans. Her ears pointed forward, alert but not alarmed, and she made no move to retreat as he stopped at the fence rail. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes and the careful way she studied his movements. "Hello, Maisie," he said softly, extending his hand palm up toward the fence. "I hear you might need a partner." The donkey stepped forward and sniffed his fingers, her breath warm and sweet with the smell of hay. After a moment, she allowed him to stroke her nose, and Elias felt some of the tension he had been carrying for weeks begin to ease. There was something profoundly calming about the simple exchange, the uncomplicated communication between two creatures who had learned to be cautious about trust. It was then he noticed the halter hanging on a post near the shelter. The leather was old and worn smooth by years of use, darkened with age and softened by countless hours of patient work. The stitching, though weathered, remained sound, and the metal fittings showed the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of respect for good equipment. Looking at it, Elias could imagine the miles it had traveled, the loads it had helped secure, the partnership between human and animal that it represented. Frank approached the fence, moving slowly so as not to disturb the moment between man and donkey. "She likes you," he observed. "Maisie's particular about folks. Took her 3 months to let my granddaughter Emma brush her, and Emma's got away with animals that would shame most horse whisperers." Elias continued stroking Maisie's nose, noting the way she leaned slightly into his touch. "She's got good eyes," he said, "patient. That's worth something in a working animal." "Worth something in a working man, too," Frank replied quietly. "You strike me as the patient type, Mr. Boone." From across the street came the sound of laughter, and both men turned to see a group of younger men emerging from the saloon. They had clearly been drinking, though the evening was still young, and their voices carried the particular edge that came with too much whiskey and too little purpose. "Well, look there," one of them called out, his voice loud enough to carry clearly. Across the dusty street, old Frank's found himself a new hand. Question is, what's the poor fellow going to ride? That sway-backed old mule? More laughter followed, and Elias felt his jaw tighten despite his efforts to remain calm. He had grown accustomed to mockery over the past weeks, but something about hearing it directed at Maisie stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him. "Now, boys," Frank called back, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "No call for that kind of talk. A man's got to work with what he has." Work with what he has. The same voice, belonging to a thin man with a scraggly beard, and clothes that suggested more ambition than achievement. "Frank, that donkey's older than dirt, and this fellow looks like he ain't got 2 coins to rub together. How's he going to make any kind of living hauling freight on foot behind a donkey?" The question hung in the air, and Elias realized that this moment would define how the town saw him for however long he remained in Dead Hollow. He could respond with anger, defend himself and Maisie, with the kind of words that would only confirm their assessment of him as a man down on his luck and sensitive about it. Or he could let the moment pass and accept whatever reputation their mockery created for him. But as he looked at Maisie, still standing patiently at the fence, with her dark eyes watching the commotion across the street, he made a different choice. "Entirely, I reckon," he said, his voice carrying clearly but without challenge, "that a man with a good donkey and a willingness to work can make his way just about anywhere. Might not look like much to some folks, but looks and reality don't always match up." The thin man started to respond, but Frank cut him off with a gesture that carried decades of authority. "That's enough, Pete. You boys go on about your business, and let me tend to mine." As the group moved on, their laughter fading into the evening air, Frank turned back to Elias. "Don't pay them any mind," he said. "Pete Garrison's got a mouth that runs faster than his brain, and the others just follow along because they don't have anything better to do." Elias nodded, though he understood that the encounter was just the beginning. In a town where entertainment was scarce and newcomers were rare, his partnership with Maisie would provide endless material for those who found humor in other people's circumstances. The question was whether he could build something worthwhile, despite their amusement. "When would you like me to start?" he asked Frank. The old rancher smiled. "How about tomorrow morning? Give you a chance to get properly acquainted with Maisie, and I'll round up some work that needs doing. Nothing too ambitious at first, just enough to see how you two work together." As the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that softened even Dead Hollow's harsh edges, Elias remained at the fence with Maisie. The donkey had settled into a comfortable position near the rail, close enough that he could continue stroking her neck while they both watched the town settle into evening routines. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and undoubtedly more mockery from those who found entertainment in his circumstances. But for now, in the quiet companionship of an animal who asked nothing more than patient kindness, Elias Boone felt something he had not experienced since losing Sarah and the ranch. The possibility that he might still have something useful to offer the world. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridges when the sound of galloping horses shattered the peaceful quiet of Dead Hollow. Elias had been sharing coffee with Frank on the ranch's front porch, discussing the day's planned work with Maisie, when the thundering hoofbeats cut through their conversation like gunshots. 6 riders burst around the bend in the road, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hidden behind bandanas pulled high against the dust. Even from a distance, everything about them spoke of violence barely held in check, the way they sat their saddles, the casual manner in which they held their weapons, the predatory scanning of their surroundings as they rode. "Emma," Frank's cup shattered against the porch boards as he lurched to his feet. "Emma, get inside!" But 8-year-old Emma Hendricks had been playing in the front yard, completely absorbed in an elaborate tea party she had arranged for her collection of dolls. Beneath the old cottonwood tree, the sound of her grandfather's urgent voice made her look up in confusion, her small hands still clutching the worn rag doll that had been her constant companion since her parents died in a wagon accident 2 years before. The lead rider saw her. At the same moment, Frank called out, Without hesitation, he wheeled his horse toward the yard and leaned down from his saddle, scooping Emma up with one powerful arm while she screamed in terror and confusion. The sudden motion caused her doll to tumble from her grasp, landing in the dust beneath the cottonwood, where it lay forgotten as chaos erupted around it. "Emma!" Frank's voice cracked with desperation as he ran toward the riders, but he was 72 years old, and the distance was too great. Elias moved without conscious thought, his hand dropping to his colt, but the riders were already turning their horses and spurring them toward the eastern hills before he could draw a clear shot. The sound of gunfire filled the air as other townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, some carrying rifles and shotguns, but the outlaws were prepared for resistance. They fired deliberately into the air and at the ground near the feet of anyone who moved too close, creating enough confusion and fear to cover their retreat without actually killing anyone. "Nobody follows us!" the leader shouted over the chaos, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Anyone tries to track us, the girl dies." To emphasize his point, he fired a shot that splintered the wooden sign hanging in front of the general store, sending the townspeople diving for cover. Then they were gone, disappearing into the maze of canyons and broken country that stretched eastward toward the territorial border. The dust cloud they left behind seemed to hang in the still morning air long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, settling slowly over a town that had been forever changed in the space of less than 5 minutes. Frank stood motionless in his front yard, staring at the spot where his granddaughter had been playing moments before. His face had gone grey, and his hands shook as he struggled to process what had just happened. Around him, neighbors gathered in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they tried to make sense of the attack. "We need to get word to the territorial." "Marshal," someone said. "That'll take 2 days, maybe 3, another voice replied. "They'll be long gone by then." "What about the cavalry post at Fort Morrison?" 4 days' ride, and they're probably out on patrol anyway." Elias walked slowly toward the cottonwood tree, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The rag doll lay where it had fallen, its faded dress spread around it like a flower. One button eye had come loose and hung by a thread, giving the toy a heartbreakingly vulnerable appearance. As he knelt to pick it up, he noticed the careful stitching that had been mended and remended over the years, the patches where worn fabric had been replaced with scraps from other garments, the obvious love that had gone into keeping this simple toy intact through countless hours of play. "That's Miss Catherine," Frank said quietly, appearing beside him. His voice sounded hollow, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. "Emma named her after her mother. Catherine was my daughter-in-law before the accident." He paused, his breath catching slightly. "Emma takes that doll everywhere. She'll be scared without it." The weight of those words settled over both men like a physical presence. Somewhere in the wilderness, a terrified 8-year-old girl was facing the worst experience of her young life without even the small comfort of her beloved toy. The thought was almost unbearable, yet it was reality now, as real and immediate as the dust still settling in the morning air. Marshal Tom Bradley arrived from the neighboring town of Cedar Creek by mid-afternoon, having been summoned by a rider Frank sent immediately after the attack. Bradley was a competent man in his 50s who took his responsibilities seriously, but even before he finished examining the scene, his expression made it clear that he brought little hope with him. "Jeb Blackwood," he announced after talking to several witnesses. "Has to be. The description matches, and this kind of grab-and-run is exactly his style." He stood in Frank's front yard, holding his hat in his hands, while he delivered news no one wanted to hear. "He's been hitting ranches and small towns all along the territorial border for the past 6 months. Takes what he wants, disappears into the Badlands, and by the time anyone can organize a pursuit, he's already 3 days ahead with ground that would kill most horses. Then we go after them on foot," Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction, even as he spoke the words. "Marshal," Bradley shook his head. "Frank, I understand how you feel, But you've got to be realistic here. Blackwood's not just running random. He knows exactly where he's going, and he's got the kind of men who can live rough for weeks at a time. Even if we could track them into Devil's Canyon, which is questionable, they'd see us coming from miles away and either disappear deeper into country no civilized man has ever mapped, or— He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. What about ransom? Someone asked. Maybe they'll ask for money. Maybe, Bradley agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. But Blackwood's not known for negotiating. When he takes something, he tends to keep it until it's no longer useful to him. Again, he left the darker implications unspoken. Elias had remained silent during these exchanges, standing slightly apart from the main group, while he studied the eastern horizon, where the outlaws had disappeared. Something about the marshal's words bothered him, though it took him several minutes to identify exactly what it was. "Marshal," he said finally, "you mentioned Devil's Canyon specifically. Is that where you think they're headed?" Bradley turned to look at him, taking in the worn clothes and careful manner of speaking. "You are Elias Boone. I'm working for Mr. Hendricks." Something in Bradley's expression shifted slightly, as though the name meant something to him, but he continued with his explanation. "Devil's Canyon runs about 30 miles into the high country, before it branches into a dozen smaller gorges and dead ends. Perfect place to lose a pursuit, and the terrain's so rough that horses can't handle most of it. Even if you could track them that far, there's no way to know which branch they took, and some of those side canyons go on for miles without water." "But you're certain that's where they went?" Bradley nodded grimly. "Only place they could go if they wanted to disappear completely. The other routes east would leave them exposed on open ground for too long. No, they're in Devil's Canyon, and they might as well be on the moon for all the good it does us." As the afternoon wore on and more neighbors arrived to offer support and sympathy, Elias found himself drawn repeatedly to the eastern horizon. There was something about the marshal's certainty that bothered him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. During his years with the 4th Cavalry, he had learned to trust the instincts that told him when something didn't fit the expected pattern, and those instincts were speaking to him now. The conversations around him began to take on the tone of a wake rather than a rescue planning session. People spoke in hushed voices about Emma in the past tense, offering frank memories of her laughter and bright spirit, as though these remembrances might somehow compensate for the loss they all assumed was inevitable. It was kindly meant, but Elias could see how each well-intentioned comment hit Frank like a physical blow. "She was always such a happy child," Mrs. Patterson from the general store was saying. "Always had a smile and a kind word for everyone who came into the store." "Remember how she used to help old Mr. Jameson with his garden?" added another neighbor. "She'd spend hours out there, pulling weeds and talking to the plants like they were her friends." Frank listened to it all with the patience of a man who understood that people needed to say these things, that the sharing of memories was their way of trying to help. But Elias could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the way his jaw tightened with each story, and he recognized the look of a man fighting to maintain control while his world collapsed around him. As evening approached and the neighbors began to drift back to their own homes, Elias remained on Frank's porch. The rag doll sat on the table between them, a silent reminder of the day's tragedy and the child who was somewhere in the wilderness without it. "I keep thinking about the doll," Frank said suddenly, breaking a long silence. "It's foolish, I know, but I can't stop thinking about how scared she must be without Miss Catherine. That doll has been with her through every nightmare, every thunderstorm, every time she missed her parents." His voice cracked slightly. "And now she's facing the worst thing that could happen to her, and she doesn't even have that small comfort." Elias picked up the doll and examined it again, noting the care that had gone into its construction and maintenance. Someone had loved this child enough to spend hours keeping her toy intact, mending every tear and replacing every lost button. The thought of Emma facing her current ordeal without this tangible reminder of that love was indeed almost unbearable. Mr. Hendricks. He said carefully, "What do you know about Devil's Canyon? I mean specifically the terrain, the water sources, the way the side canyons branch off." Frank looked at him with surprise. "Some, I suppose. I've hunted deer up that way a few times over the years, though never very far in." "Why?" "Just wondering." Elias continued to study the doll, his mind working through possibilities he wasn't ready to voice. The marshal seemed very certain about where they were headed. "Tom Bradley's a good man," Frank replied. "If he says Devil's Canyon is where they went, then that's where they went. The question is what good it does us to know that." Elias nodded, though privately he was beginning to think that knowing where they went might be more useful than Marshal Bradley believed. During his cavalry years, he had learned that terrain which defeated horses didn't necessarily defeat men on foot, especially men who understood how to use their environment instead of fighting against it. As full darkness settled over Dead Hollow, the two men sat in comfortable silence on the porch, each lost in his own thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound echoing off the canyon walls before fading into the night. It was a lonely sound, but also somehow hopeful, a reminder that life continued even in the harshest places, that survival was possible for those who understood the rules of the wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. But tonight, as Elias held Emma's rag doll and thought about a terrified little girl somewhere in the darkness, he began to consider possibilities that others had dismissed as impossible. 3 days had passed since Emma's kidnapping, and Dead Hollow had settled into the heavy quiet that follows tragedy when there is nothing more to be done. The territorial marshal had returned to Cedar Creek with promises to send word to the cavalry post, though everyone understood that by the time official help arrived, Emma would be either dead or so far into the wilderness that finding her would be impossible. Elias had thrown himself into work with Maisie, partly because Frank needed the distraction, and partly because physical labor helped quiet the thoughts that churned through his mind whenever he allowed himself to be still. They had hauled supplies to 3 different ranches, carried mail to a homestead family whose isolation made regular postal service impractical, and delivered medicine to an elderly woman whose arthritis kept her housebound. Simple work, but honest, and Maisie had proven herself capable and reliable in ways that surprised even Frank. The donkey moved through the rough country with a sure-footedness that put most horses to shame, picking her way across creek beds and around rockfalls, with the careful intelligence of an animal that understood the consequences of a misplaced step. More than once, Elias found himself grateful for her caution as they navigated terrain that would have challenged a more spirited mount. But it was during the quiet moments, when they rested in whatever shade they could find, while Maisie cropped grass and he shared his simple lunch with her, that Elias found his thoughts turning inevitably to Sarah. The wedding ring on his finger had grown loose during the months since her death, sliding around when he worked, but he could not bring himself to remove it. It was his last tangible connection to the woman who had shaped the best years of his life. Sarah had died slowly, consumed by the wasting sickness that took her strength bit by bit over the course of 8 terrible months. They had tried everything. Doctors. In Denver, patent medicines from traveling salesmen. Even the folk remedies suggested by well-meaning neighbors. Nothing had helped. And in the end, all Elias could do was hold her hand and promise that he would find a way to continue without her. The promise had seemed impossible to keep. They had never been blessed with children, despite years of hoping and trying, and without Sarah's laughter to fill their small ranch house, the silence had become unbearable. When the bank foreclosed after the harsh winter killed most of his cattle, Elias had felt almost relieved. Staying would have meant living every day surrounded by memories of what he had lost. But now, watching Frank struggle with his own devastating loss, Elias began to understand something he had missed during his own grief, Sarah would not have wanted him to simply survive. She would have expected him to find ways to honor the love they had shared by extending that care to others who needed it. The realization came to him gradually, like sunlight breaking through clouds. But once it settled in his mind, it brought with it both comfort and responsibility. In his shirt pocket, wrapped carefully in an oiled cloth, he carried the gold locket Sarah had worn every day of their marriage. Inside was a photograph taken on their wedding day, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that comes only to people who know they are truly loved. Sometimes, when the loneliness became too much to bear, he would take out the locket and study that photograph, trying to imagine what she would tell him about his current circumstances. He thought she would approve of his partnership with Maisie, and he was certain she would have been deeply moved by Frank's devotion to his granddaughter. Sarah had always been drawn to stories of families overcoming hardship, and she would have understood immediately why the old rancher's pain resonated so deeply with Elias. "You're thinking again," Frank observed, as they sat on his front porch after another day of small jobs around the territory. "I can see it in your face. Got that look men get when they're chewing on something too big to swallow easily." Elias smiled at the description, though his expression remained thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Emma," he admitted, "about whether there might be possibilities that haven't been considered." Frank's face tightened slightly. "Tom Bradley's a good marshal, Elias. If he says there's nothing to be done, then there's nothing to be done. I've got to accept that, hard as it is." "I'm not questioning the marshal's competence," Elias said carefully. "But sometimes people who know an area really well can miss things that might be obvious to someone with different experience." "What? A kind of different experience?" Elias hesitated, aware that he was approaching territory he had not discussed with anyone since arriving in Dead Hollow. "During my time with the Cavalry, I did some scouting work. Spent a lot of time learning how to read terrain, how to move through country that conventional wisdom said was impassable." Frank studied him with new interest. "You never mentioned scouting. Most folks hear cavalry and think of charging horses and saber fights," Elias explained. "The reality was usually a lot more like what I'm doing now, moving carefully through difficult country, paying attention to details, trying to understand the landscape well enough to use it instead of fighting against it." "And you think that experience might be useful here?" "Maybe." Elias pulled out a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket, a rough map he had been working on during their travels around the territory. "I've been asking questions, listening to stories about Devil's Canyon and the country beyond it. Started putting together what I've learned." Frank leaned forward to study the map, noting the careful way Elias had marked elevation changes, water sources, and the various trails that led into the canyon system. "This is detailed work," he said with surprise. "When did you have time to put all this together?" "Evenings, mostly. And I've been asking questions of everyone we've met during our supply runs. Amazing what people know about country they've lived near all their lives, even if they've never thought to put it all together in one place." The map showed not just Devil's Canyon itself, but the network of smaller canyons and arroyos that fed into it from the north and south. Elias had marked seasonal water sources, game trails, and even the locations of old mining claims that had been abandoned when the ore played out. Most significantly, he had traced several routes that appeared to loop back toward the main canyon, from unexpected directions. "What's this line here?" Frank asked, pointing to a thin pencil mark that seemed to climb impossibly steep terrain before disappearing into an area marked with question marks. "Apache Trail," Elias replied. "At least, that's what old Pete Morrison told me when I delivered supplies to his ranch yesterday. He said his grandfather used to talk about seeing smoke signals from up there during the Indian troubles, but nobody ever found the actual trail because it's too narrow for horses." Frank looked up from the map, with something approaching hope. "For the first time in days. Too narrow for horses, maybe, but not for people on foot. That's what I'm thinking. And definitely not too narrow for a sure-footed donkey who's used to picking her way through difficult country." From across the street came the sound of laughter, and both men looked up to see Pete Garrison and his usual companions emerging from the saloon. Even at a distance, it was clear they had been drinking steadily since afternoon, and their voices carried the particular edge that comes with alcohol and boredom. "Look there!" Pete called out, his words slightly slurred but still audible. "It's the donkey cavalry planning their next great expedition." "What are you two going to haul tomorrow, Boone? Maybe a load of hay for that sway-backed mule of yours?" More laughter followed, but this time Elias barely heard it. His attention was focused entirely on Frank's face, on the way the old ranchers. Eyes had brightened as he studied the map, on the subtle change in his posture that suggested hope was replacing despair. "You really think it's possible," Frank asked quietly, "to get into Devil's Canyon without being seen?" "I think," Elias said carefully, "that a man with the right partner and enough patience might be able to go places that others would consider impossible. Question is whether it's worth the risk." Frank looked at the map for a long moment, then at the rag doll still sitting on the table beside them. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "My son died in a wagon accident 2 years ago. Took his wife with him, left Emma an orphan at 6 years old. I promised them both, standing over their graves, that I'd take care of that little girl no matter what." He paused, his hands clenching slightly. "If there's even a chance of getting her back, then it's worth any risk." As the evening settled around them, and the mockery from across the street faded into the general noise of the town, Elias found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week before. Sarah's locket seemed to grow warm against his chest, as though her presence was somehow approving of the choice he was about to make. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "it's time Maisie and I took a closer look at that canyon." The next morning brought an opportunity that would either prove or disprove Elias's growing confidence in Maisie's capabilities. Doc Henley had received word that Mrs. Patterson at the Broken Circle Ranch was having complications with a difficult birth, and he needed someone to carry his medical supplies up the treacherous trail to the remote homestead. The path was notorious for claiming horses. Too many loose rocks, too many narrow ledges, where a nervous animal could lose its footing and take both itself and its rider into the canyon below. "I'll pay double the usual rate," Doc Henley said as he loaded his saddlebags with instruments and medicines. "But I won't lie to you, Boone. 2 good horses have been lost on that trail in the past 5 years, and both their riders barely escaped with their lives." Elias studied the steep path that wound up the canyon wall toward the Broken Circle, noting the places where rockfall had narrowed the trail and the sharp switchbacks that would test any animal's sure-footedness. "What do you think, Maisie?" he asked the donkey, who was already sniffing curiously at the medical supplies. "Feel like showing these folks what you can do?" The climb took 3 hours, but Maisie navigated every treacherous section with the careful precision of an animal that understood the consequences of carelessness. Where the trail narrowed to barely 18 inches of solid footing, she placed each hoof with deliberate care, testing the surface before committing her weight. At the worst switchbacks, where loose shale threatened to give way under pressure, she seemed to redistribute her balance instinctively, keeping herself and her cargo stable even when rocks tumbled away into the canyon depths. Watching her work, Elias was reminded of the Apache scouts he had served with during his cavalry years. They had possessed the same quality of patient attention to terrain, the same ability to read the landscape and move through it as though they were part of it, rather than fighting against it. The memory brought with it a flood of images he had spent years trying to forget: the endless patrols through hostile territory, the constant awareness that survival depended on understanding every detail of the environment around them. He had been young then, barely 25 when he first arrived at Fort Apache with orders to join the 4th Cavalry's scouting operations. The Apache wars were winding down, but the remaining bands were desperate and dangerous, and the army needed men who could track them through country that defied conventional military tactics. Elias had volunteered for the assignment partly out of ambition, and partly because the extra pay would help him save money for the ranch he planned to buy when his enlistment ended. What he had learned during those years went far beyond military tactics. The Apache scouts who taught him to read, sign, and navigate impossible terrain had also taught him to see the wilderness as something other than an enemy to be conquered. Under their patient instruction, he had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that revealed water sources in apparently barren country, to identify the game trails that could provide passage through otherwise impassable terrain, and to move silently through landscapes that would betray the presence of less careful travelers. One scout in particular, an older man named Joseph, whose Apache name had been deemed too difficult for military records, had taken special interest in teaching Elias the finer points of what he called thinking like the land. It was Joseph who had taught him that the most dangerous terrain often provided the safest routes, simply because enemies would not expect anyone to attempt passage through areas that appeared impossible. White man always wants to fight the ground. Joseph had explained during one of their long patrols. Apache learns to ask the ground what it wants, then uses that knowledge. Rock that looks weak might be strongest. Path that looks easy might be trap. The wisdom of those words had saved Elias's life more than once during his remaining years of service, and as he watched Maisie carefully pick her way up the treacherous trail to the broken circle, he realized that the donkey possessed the same instinctive understanding of terrain that Joseph had tried to teach him. By the time they reached the ranch, word of their successful ascent had somehow preceded them. Mrs. Patterson's husband was waiting with obvious relief, having expected that Doc Henley's supplies would arrive too late to be of any use. The birth went well, and by evening Elias and Maisie were descending the canyon trail with the satisfied knowledge that their careful work had contributed to saving 2 lives, mother and child, both healthy and thriving. Frank was waiting for them at the bottom of the trail, his face showing a mixture of admiration and something that might have been hope. "Doc Henley says that donkey of yours handled that climb better than any horse he's ever seen try it," he said, as Elias unsaddled Maisie and checked her hooves for damage. "Says you've got a real partner there." "She did good," Elias agreed, running his hands along Maisie's legs to check for cuts or swelling. "Better than good, actually. There were places up there where I thought we might have to turn back, but she found ways through that I wouldn't have believed possible." That evening, as they sat on Frank's porch sharing a simple supper, the old rancher began talking about Emma in a way he hadn't since the kidnapping. Instead of dwelling on his fears for her safety, he spoke about her future, about the plans he had been making for her education and the hopes he carried for the woman she would become. "She's got her father's mind," he said, cutting thin slices from a wheel of cheese one of the neighbors had brought by. "Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things work. I've been thinking about sending her to school in Denver when she gets older, maybe even back east if she shows the inclination for it." He paused, his expression growing wistful. "Her grandmother, my late wife, always said that education was the one thing nobody could take away from you once you had it." "Sounds like she's lucky to have you looking out for her interests," Elias said. "I hope so. I worry sometimes that I'm too old to be raising a young girl, that I don't understand the things she needs. But she's all the family I have left, and I'd do anything to make sure she has every chance at a good life." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Marshal Bradley emerged from the darkness, his horse lathered and his face grim with news that no one wanted to hear. "Frank," he said without preamble, "I've got a message from the Blackwood gang. They're asking for ransom." The amount they demanded was staggering. More money than existed in the entire town of Dead Hollow, more than most small ranches could generate in 5 years of good harvests. But it wasn't just the impossibility of raising such a sum that made the message devastating. It was the deadline. 3 days to deliver the money to a specific location in Devil's Canyon, or Emma would be killed. They want the money left at Eagle Rock, Bradley explained, consulting the crude map that had accompanied the ransom demand. It's about 15 miles into the canyon system, right at the confluence of two major gorges. Impossible to approach. Without being seen, perfect place for an ambush if anyone tries to get clever. The town meeting that followed was a brief and futile exercise. Everyone understood that raising the ransom was impossible, and everyone understood that attempting a rescue through the canyon approaches would be suicide. The outlaws held every advantage: superior numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and defensive positions that would allow them to spot any conventional rescue attempt long before it posed any threat. "I'm sorry, Frank," Marshal Bradley said finally. "If there was anything I could do, any way to organize a posse that had even a remote chance of success, I'd do it. But the truth is, we'd just be throwing away more lives without helping Emma." After the meeting disbanded and the neighbors returned to their homes with heavy hearts, Elias remained on Frank's porch while the old rancher sat in stunned silence. The enormity of their helplessness seemed to press down on them like a physical weight, making even simple conversation feel impossible. It was then that Elias made a decision that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew him. Quietly, he went to his small bundle of possessions and withdrew something he had not looked at since leaving Colorado. A small wooden box wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden at the bottom of his saddlebag. Inside the box, nestled in faded blue, velvet, was a medal he had never expected to receive and certainly never expected to need again. The Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for his actions during the final Apache campaign when he had held off an entire war party single-handedly, while wounded cavalry troopers escaped to safety. The citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But Elias remembered it simply as the longest night of his life, spent behind a pile of rocks with a rifle and the growing certainty that he would not live to see morning. He had survived that night by thinking like Joseph had taught him, by using the terrain instead of fighting it, by moving when his enemies expected him to remain still, and staying silent when they expected him to run. The tactics that had kept him alive then might be applicable now, though the stakes were different, and the mission would require patience rather than desperate courage. Frank found him there an hour later, staring at the medal in the lamplight, while Maisie dozed contentedly in her corral nearby. "I didn't know," Frank said simply. "Most people don't. It's not something that comes up in ordinary conversation." Elias rewrapped the medal carefully and returned it to his saddlebag. "But it occurs to me that a man doesn't earn something like that by accepting the conventional wisdom about what's possible and what isn't." Frank studied his face in the dim light, recognizing something he hadn't seen there before. "You're thinking about going after her?" "I'm thinking," Elias said quietly, "that a man with the right partner and enough patience might be able to accomplish things that others would consider impossible. And I'm thinking that little girl deserves to have someone try." The 3 days since Emma's kidnapping had passed with agonizing slowness, each sunrise bringing fresh reminders that time was running out and no solution had emerged. The town had settled into a grim routine of whispered conversations and meaningful glances, the kind of behavior that accompanies tragedies everyone understands, but no one knows how to address. Elias had spent those 3 days conducting what he privately thought of as reconnaissance, though he was careful not to use military terminology when discussing his activities with Frank or anyone else in Dead Hollow. Each morning, he and Maisie set out on what appeared to be routine supply runs or delivery work, but their routes had been carefully planned to bring them as close as possible to the eastern approaches to Devil's Canyon. What he discovered during these careful surveys both encouraged and worried him. The main approaches to the canyon were indeed as hopeless as Marshal Bradley had suggested. Wide, exposed trails that offered no concealment and multiple vantage points from which sentries could observe anyone approaching from miles away. But the closer he looked at the terrain, the more convinced he became that these obvious routes were not the only possibilities. On the second day, while delivering grain to a homestead that sat at the very edge of the canyon country, Elias had noticed something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the geography of the area. From a ridge overlooking the main canyon, he could see what appeared to be a series of narrow cuts and arroyos that angled in from the north, following paths that would be invisible from the main canyon floor. They were the kind of routes that would never appear on any official map because they were too narrow and dangerous for normal travel, but they might offer possibilities for someone willing to take extraordinary risks. Maisie had proven herself invaluable during these reconnaissance missions. Her ability to navigate treacherous terrain allowed them to reach vantage points that would have been impossible for a man on horseback, and her patient nature made it possible to spend long periods observing the landscape without the restlessness that would have made a horse difficult to control. More than once, Elias found himself grateful for her steady presence as they picked their way along ledges barely wide enough for safe passage during one particularly challenging climb to reach. An overlook that provided a clear view of the canyon's interior, Maisie demonstrated a level of intelligence that genuinely surprised him. When the trail they were following narrowed to the point where a single misstep would send them both tumbling into the depths below, she had stopped and studied the terrain ahead with the same careful attention Elias had seen Apache scouts use. When evaluating dangerous ground, after several minutes of what appeared to be serious consideration, she had chosen a route that led slightly upward and to the left, following a path that was barely visible among the rocks, but proved to be both stable and secure. Only when they reached the overlook did Elias realize that her choice had not only been safer than the more obvious route, but had also brought them to a position that offered a much better view of the canyon interior. "You've been thinking about this, haven't you?" he said to her as they rested in the shade of a large boulder. "You understand what we're trying to do here." Maisie regarded him with the patient attention she gave to most of his conversational efforts, her dark eyes holding what he was beginning to recognize as a distinctly intelligent expression. During their weeks of working together, he had noticed that she seemed to anticipate his needs and intentions in ways that went beyond simple animal training. She appeared to understand not just what he wanted her to do, but why he wanted her to do it. It was from this overlook that Elias first noticed the markings. They were subtle, small stacks of stones arranged in patterns that would have looked random to most observers, but which triggered memories of his time with Apache scouts who had used similar markers to indicate safe routes through dangerous territory. The markings were old, weathered by years of exposure, but they followed a clear pattern that suggested a trail system leading into the canyon from an unexpected direction. That evening, as he sat at Frank's kitchen table working on the detailed map he had been developing, Elias found himself thinking about the markings and what they might mean. His map had grown increasingly complex over the past few days, incorporating not just the obvious geographic features, but also the subtle details that determined whether particular routes were feasible or suicidal. He had drawn elevations based on his observations and calculations, marked water sources and shelter possibilities, and noted the locations where the terrain would provide concealment from sentries positioned on the main canyon walls. Most importantly, he had begun to trace what appeared to be a possible approach route that would avoid the exposed areas entirely, following the narrow arroyos and hidden cuts he had observed during his reconnaissance. "That's getting complicated," Frank observed, looking over his shoulder at the increasingly detailed map. "You've got more information there than most surveying expeditions manage to collect." "Habit, I suppose," Elias replied, adding another notation about rock stability. Along one of the potential routes, During my cavalry years, understanding terrain often meant the difference between completing a mission and walking into an ambush. You learn to pay attention to details that might not seem important until you need them. Frank settled into the chair across from him, wincing slightly as his joints protested the movement. "You mentioned before that you never had children," he said quietly. "Mind if I ask whether that was by choice or circumstance?" The question hit Elias more deeply than he had expected. He paused in his map-making, his pencil hovering over the paper while he considered how much of his private pain he was willing to share. "Sarah and I tried for 8 years," he said finally. "We wanted children more than anything else in the world. It just never happened for us." "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "The hardest part," Elias continued, surprising himself, with his willingness to speak about something he had never discussed with anyone, was watching how it affected her. Sarah would have been a wonderful mother. She had such patience, such natural gentleness with children. Every time we attended a christening or watched neighbor children playing, I could see in her eyes how much she wanted that for us. Frank nodded with the understanding of a man who had experienced his own share of loss. "Emma's been the light of my life since her parents died," he said. "I never expected to be raising a child at my age, but she's brought more joy into these old bones than I had any right to expect. She's lucky to have you. I used to think I was the lucky one. Now—" Frank's voice trailed off as he stared at the map, perhaps trying to make sense of the careful notations and route markings. "Elias, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer." "All right. Do you really think there's a chance? Not hope, not wishful thinking, but a real, honest chance of getting her back alive?" Elias set down his pencil and studied the map he had been working on. The potential route he had traced was dangerous beyond anything he had attempted, even during his military service. It would require perfect timing, exceptional luck, and skills he had not used in years. But as he looked at the careful markings that indicated possible paths through terrain everyone else considered impassable, he realized that his answer was more honest than he had expected it to be. "I think," he said carefully, "that a man with the right partner and enough patience might be able to reach places that others would consider impossible. Whether that's enough to help Emma depends on what we find when we get there." From across the street came the familiar sound of laughter and raised voices as Pete Garrison and his companions emerged from the saloon. Their mockery had grown more, pointed over the past few days, as though Emma's situation had somehow validated their original assessment of Elias and Maisie as figures of ridicule rather than respect. "Look there," Pete's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "The donkey. Cavalry's still planning their great expedition. Maybe they think they can rescue the girl by hauling her out in a freight wagon pulled by that old mule." More laughter followed, but this time Frank stood up and walked to the window, his face set in hard lines. "Those fools have no idea what they're talking about," he said quietly. "They think this is all some kind of joke." Elias continued working on his map, adding details about the rock formations he had observed near the Apache trail markers. "Let them laugh," he said. "Sometimes the best way to accomplish something difficult is to make sure nobody takes you seriously enough to interfere." Frank turned from the window and studied Elias with new respect. "You're planning to do this, aren't you? You're actually planning to go into Devil's Canyon after her." "I'm planning," Elias said, as he carefully folded the completed map, "to see what's possible. And I'm planning to have a very serious conversation with Maisie about whether she's willing to take a walk that's going to test everything we've learned about working together." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Maisie appeared at the corral fence, looking toward the house with the alert attention that had become her characteristic expression. In the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window, her eyes seemed to hold both intelligence and something that might have been anticipation, as though she understood that their careful preparation was building towards something significant. Tomorrow would bring the final day before the Ransom deadline, and with it the need to make decisions. But tonight, As Elias studied his detailed map and thought about the subtle trail markers that suggested possibilities others had missed, he felt something he had not experienced since leaving Colorado, the sense that he might still be capable of making a difference in the world. The final day before the Ransom deadline dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made distant objects appear deceptively close. Elias had risen before sunrise to complete his mapping of the canyon's hidden approaches, and as he checked his equipment in the pre-dawn darkness, his fingers found the familiar weight of the compass that had guided him through countless military campaigns. The instrument was a thing of beauty, brass polished to a warm glow, with careful engravings that marked not just the cardinal directions, but also the subtle gradations that could mean the difference between finding water and dying of thirst in hostile territory. Sarah had given it to him as a going-away present. When he first enlisted, though she had later confessed that she hoped he would never need to use its more advanced features. "Promise me," she had said on the night before he left for his first deployment, "that you'll use this to find your way back to me, no matter how far they send you or how dangerous it gets." He had kept that promise through 3 years of Apache campaigns, using the compass to navigate through terrain that defeated conventional methods of pathfinding. It had guided him through desert wastes, where landmarks shifted with every sandstorm, through mountain passes where magnetic anomalies made ordinary navigation instruments unreliable, and through the nightmarish landscape of his final mission, when he had held off an entire war party while wounded soldiers escaped to safety. But the compass had not been enough to guide him through the 8 months of Sarah's final illness. All his military skills, all his experience with impossible situations and desperate circumstances had proven useless against the wasting sickness that took her strength day by day. He had tried everything, sought out specialists in Denver, consulted with folk healers who claimed knowledge of remedies unknown to medical science, even traveled to a mission settlement where Catholic nuns were said to have miraculous healing powers. Nothing had worked. In the end, all his training and experience had amounted to nothing more than the ability to hold her hand and promise that he would find a way to continue without her. It was the one promise he had made that he was not certain he could keep. Now, as he studied the compass by lamplight and prepared for what might be his final mission, Elias realized that Sarah's death had taught him something he had not understood during his military service. The most important battles were not always the ones fought against external enemies. Sometimes, the greatest challenge was finding the courage to care deeply about another person's welfare, when you knew that caring meant accepting the possibility of devastating loss. Emma's kidnapping had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Sarah, the fierce protectiveness that comes with loving someone enough to risk everything for their safety. He had not expected to feel that kind of connection to Frank's granddaughter, but something about her bright spirit and trusting nature had reminded him of all the children he and Sarah had hoped to have. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway as Elias was putting away the compass, his face showing the sleepless exhaustion that had become his constant companion since Emma's disappearance. "You're up early," the old rancher observed, though his tone suggested that he had not been sleeping. "Either wanted to make final checks on the route," Elias replied, indicating the detailed map spread across the kitchen table. During the past week, his careful observations had transformed the simple sketch into something approaching a professional survey, complete with elevation markings, water sources, and notations about terrain stability. Frank studied the map with growing amazement. "This is military-quality work," he said finally. "I've seen surveying maps that weren't this detailed." "Old habits," Elias said, though privately he was proud of the accuracy he had achieved. The map represented not just geographic information, but also tactical analysis of the sort that had kept him alive during his cavalry years. Every route was evaluated for concealment possibilities, escape options, and the likelihood of encountering enemy sentries. Most importantly, The map showed something that conventional wisdom insisted was impossible. A route into Devil's Canyon that avoided all the obvious approaches and made use of terrain features that would be impassable for horses, but potentially manageable for someone with Maisie's unique capabilities. The key insight had come during his final reconnaissance mission, when he had discovered fresh horse tracks in a location that should have been completely inaccessible to mounted riders. The tracks were several days old, but they were definitely recent, and they proved that the outlaws knew about routes through the canyon system that others had missed entirely. More significantly, the tracks suggested that the Blackwood gang was using the same network of hidden trails that the Apache trail markers had indicated. This meant that Elias's military experience with Apache tactics might be directly applicable to understanding how the outlaws moved through terrain that appeared impossible. "Frank," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it seriously before you answer." The old rancher settled into his chair, his expression indicating that he understood the gravity of what was coming. "Go ahead. If I were to attempt a rescue, and I'm not saying I've decided to, just if, would you be able to keep it secret? The whole town would have to believe that nothing was being attempted, that we've accepted the situation as hopeless." Frank studied his face for a long moment. "You really think you can do this?" "I think," Elias said slowly, "that Maisie and I might be able to reach places that horses can't go, and I think that a man who spent 3 years learning to think like Apache scouts might be able to use tactics that conventional wisdom would reject as impossible. What would you need from me? Complete secrecy, first and foremost. If word gets out that someone's attempting a rescue, they'll kill Emma immediately and disappear deeper into country where even I couldn't follow them." Elias paused, studying the map one final time. "And I'd need you to understand that this is not a certainty. The chances of success are not good, and there's a real possibility that I won't come back." Frank was quiet for several minutes, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making peace with an impossible decision. "Elias, I've lived 72 years, and I've learned that some things are worth any risk. That little girl is everything to me. She's all the family I have left, all the hope I have for the future. If there's even a chance of getting her back, then I don't care how dangerous." "It is." "All right," Elias said simply. "Then I'll need you to act like a man who's given up hope. Let the town see you accepting the situation. Maybe even start talking about funeral arrangements. The more hopeless everyone thinks things are, the less likely anyone is to interfere with what I'm planning." As the morning progressed and the town began to stir, Elias made his final preparations with the methodical care that had served him well during his military years. He checked and rechecked his equipment, studied the map until every detail was committed to memory, and spent long minutes with Maisie, making sure she understood that they were about to undertake something far more challenging than their previous work together. The donkey seemed to sense the seriousness of the situation. She stood quietly while he examined her hooves for any signs of damage that might affect her performance on difficult terrain, and she submitted patiently to his inspection of her tack to ensure that everything was in perfect condition. Most tellingly, when he led her to the corral fence and showed her the map, pointing out the route they would need to follow, Maisie studied the paper with the same careful attention she gave to difficult terrain. Whether she actually understood the significance of what he was showing her was impossible to determine, but her focused attention suggested that she recognized the importance of what they were about to attempt. From across the street came the familiar sound of Pete Garrison's morning commentary, delivered loudly enough to ensure that anyone within a block could hear his assessment of the situation. "Well, looks like the donkey cavalry's finally given up on their great rescue plan," Pete announced to his companions. "Guess even old Boone's got enough sense to know when he's beaten." Elias smiled grimly as he listened to the mockery that would provide perfect cover for what he was actually planning. By evening, he and Maisie would be climbing toward Devil's Canyon through terrain that everyone else considered impassable, following trails that had been used by Apache warriors and now by outlaws who understood that the most dangerous routes often provided the greatest security. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow warm against his chest, as though Sarah's blessing was somehow traveling across the years to guide him toward what might be his most important mission. Tonight, he would discover whether a broken-down cowboy and a patient donkey could accomplish something that trained lawmen had dismissed as impossible. Marshal Bradley arrived in Dead Hollow just after noon, his horse lathered and his face bearing the grim expression of a man carrying news that no one wanted to hear. In his saddlebags were updated wanted posters that had just arrived from the territorial capital, along with intelligence reports about the Blackwood gang that made their previous crimes seem almost modest by comparison. "Frank," Bradley called, out as he dismounted in front of the general store. "I need to talk to you and anyone else who might have information about this gang. We've got new details that change everything we thought we knew about them." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around the marshal as he spread the wanted posters on a makeshift table. The faces staring back from the crude drawings were hard and merciless, the kind of men who had learned to survive by being more vicious than anyone they encountered. But it was the poster showing the gang's leader that caused Elias's blood to turn cold in his veins. The drawing was rough, but the features were unmistakable. The narrow face, the scar running from left temple to jawline, the cold eyes that had once looked at Elias with the respect shared between soldiers who had faced death together. Written beneath the sketch, in the careful lettering used for official documents, was a name that brought back memories Elias had spent years trying to forget. Jebediah Blackwood, former sergeant, 4th Cavalry Regiment. "Jesus," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible above the general murmur of conversation around the wanted posters. Frank noticed his reaction immediately. "You know him?" Elias stared at the poster, his mind racing through implications that made their situation infinitely more dangerous than anyone had realized. "I know him," he said quietly. "We served together in the Apache campaigns. His name was Jeb Thornton then, before he apparently decided that Blackwood sounded more intimidating." Marshal Bradley looked up from his papers with sharp interest. "You're saying this gang leader is former cavalry?" "Former cavalry, former partner, former friend," Elias replied, his voice carrying the weight of old betrayals and bitter disappointments. "We rode together for 2 years, covered each other's backs through more dangerous situations than I care to remember. I thought he was dead." The crowd around the table had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing the revelation of something significant. Frank studied Elias's face with growing concern, recognizing the kind of pain that came not just from loss, but from the discovery that someone you had trusted had chosen a path that made them unrecognizable. "What happened between you?" Bradley asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his thoughts returning to a night 12 years before, when everything he thought he knew about honor and loyalty had been shattered by a single act of cowardice. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful control of a man discussing events that still had the power to cause him pain. "It was during the final Apache campaign, up near the Mogollon Rim. Our patrol had been ambushed while escorting a supply train through hostile territory. We were pinned down in a box canyon with wounded men and not enough ammunition to hold off a sustained attack." He paused, studying the wanted poster as though it might somehow provide answers to questions that had haunted him for years. "Jeb was our best scout, had an instinct for reading terrain that saved our lives more times than I could count. When the Apache war party began their final assault, he volunteered to create a diversion that would allow the wounded to be evacuated. Said he knew a way through the rocks that would let him lead them away from our position." Frank leaned forward, sensing that the story was building towards something terrible. "But that's not what happened." "No," Elias said simply. "What happened was that Jeb used his knowledge of the terrain to escape, leaving the rest of us to face The attack alone. We found out later that he had already been in contact with deserters and army outlaws operating along the territorial border. The ambush itself might have been his idea, a way to eliminate witnesses to his planned desertion while claiming he died heroically in the attack. Marshal Bradley's expression had grown increasingly grim as he listened to the story. How many men were lost? 7 dead, 12 wounded. I managed to hold a defensive position long enough for most of the wounded to escape, but it was a near thing. If the Apache hadn't decided to withdraw rather than take the casualties necessary to overrun our position, we would have all died. There, Elias touched the spot on his chest where Sarah's locket rested beneath his shirt. I received a medal for that action, though I've never felt like I deserved it. The real hero should have been Jeb, if he had done what he promised to do. And you never saw him again after that night? Never. The army declared him killed in action, and I let myself believe that maybe he had died trying to carry out his mission. It was easier than accepting that someone I had trusted with my life had betrayed everyone who depended on him. Elias folded the wanted poster carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket. I see now that I was being naive. The implications of this revelation began to sink in among the gathered townspeople. If the gang's leader was someone who knew Elias personally, who understood his capabilities and his methods, then the situation was far more complex than anyone had realized. This was not just a random kidnapping for ransom. It was something else entirely. "Frank," Elias said quietly, "I need to ask you something important. When Emma was taken, did any of the outlaws say anything that suggested they knew who I was? Any mention of my name or my past?" Frank thought carefully before answering. "Now that you mention it, the leader did seem to be looking directly at your house when he made his threat about anyone following them. I thought it was just coincidence, but maybe it wasn't coincidence," Elias said with growing certainty. "Jeb knows exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. This whole thing, the kidnapping, the impossible ransom demand, the location he chose for the exchange, it's all designed specifically for me." Marshal Bradley shook his head in confusion. "But why? What would he gain by targeting you specifically?" The answer came to Elias with the suddenness of revelation, bringing with it a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature. "Revenge," he said simply. "Jeb always blamed me for what happened that night, claimed that if I had supported his plan instead of questioning it, things would have gone differently. He's been carrying that grudge for 12 years, and now he's found a way to force me into a situation where I'll have to face him on ground of his choosing." "You think he's been planning this for years?" "I think," Elias said slowly, "that Jeb Blackwood has spent a long time learning everything he could about my current circumstances, waiting for the right opportunity to settle an old score. The fact that he chose Frank's granddaughter as his target isn't random. He knows that I won't be able to walk away from a child in danger, especially after what happened to my own hopes for a family." The crowd around the table had grown restless as they listened to this exchange, and Pete Garrison finally voiced what many of them were thinking. "So what does this mean for Emma? If this is all some kind of personal vendetta, what happens to her?" Elias studied the wanted poster again, trying to reconcile the face of his former partner with the man who had become one of the territory's most feared outlaws. The scar was new, probably acquired during the violent years since his desertion, but the eyes were the same, intelligent, calculating, and completely without the warmth that had once made him a trusted comrade. "It means," he said finally, "that Jeb is expecting me to come after her. This whole situation has been designed to force me into the canyon on his terms, probably so he can finish what he started 12 years ago." Frank's face had gone pale as he absorbed the implications. "Then it's a trap. Everything. The ransom, demand, the location, the timeline. It's all meant to lure you into a situation where he can kill you." "Almost certainly," Elias agreed. "But it also means something else. Jeb wouldn't have gone to all this trouble unless he intended to keep Emma alive until I arrive. She's not just a kidnapping victim, she's bait in a trap that's been 12 years in the making. Marshal Bradley gathered up the wanted posters with the movements of a man who had reached the end of his options. Then we can't let you go. If this is a personal vendetta, if he's specifically targeting you, then attempting a rescue would be exactly what he wants. Maybe, Elias said quietly, but it also means that I know things about Jeb that might help me anticipate his moves. During our time together, I learned how he thinks, how he plans, what kind of tactical mistakes he's likely to make when he's angry or overconfident. He pulled out his detailed map of Devil's Canyon and spread it on the table, pointing to specific locations that had taken on new significance in light of what he now knew about his opponent. Jeb always preferred defensive positions that gave him multiple escape routes. He's probably holding Emma somewhere that allows him to control access while maintaining the ability to disappear if things go wrong. Where? Frank asked, leaning over the map with desperate hope. Elias studied the terrain markings for several minutes, applying his knowledge of Jeb's tactical preferences to the geography of the canyon system. When he finally placed his finger on a specific location, his expression carried the confidence of a man who understood his enemy's thinking. Here, he said, indicating a narrow side canyon that branched off from the main gorge about 8 miles from the Ransom drop point. It's defensible, has water, and offers 3 different escape routes if he needs to run. Most importantly, it's positioned so that anyone approaching through the obvious routes would be visible for miles, but someone coming from the north through the old Apache trails might be able to get close without being detected. Marshal Bradley studied the location with growing amazement. How can you be so certain? Because 12 years ago, when we were both young soldiers trying to survive in hostile territory, Jeb and I spent 3 days holed up in that exact spot while an Apache war party searched for us. He loved that position, called it the perfect hideout because it made you feel safe while giving you complete control over anyone who might threaten you. Elias folded the map carefully and returned it to his vest. The question is whether he remembers that I was there with him, and whether he's counting on me to remember it too. As the afternoon wore on, and the implications of this revelation settled over Dead Hollow, Elias found himself facing a choice that was both simpler and more complex than anything he had anticipated. Simple because he now knew exactly where to find Emma and had a clear understanding of what he was up against. Complex because he understood that Jeb Blackwood had spent 12 years planning this confrontation, and everything that happened next would be shaped by grudges and betrayals that went far deeper than a simple kidnapping for ransom. The sun was beginning to set behind the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Elias of the evening he had first arrived in Dead Hollow with nothing but worn boots and a broken heart. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with a man who had once been his brother-in-arms and was now his most dangerous enemy. But tonight, as he sat on Frank's porch and watched Maisie graze peacefully in her corral, Elias felt something he had not experienced since leaving Colorado, the cold certainty that came with understanding exactly what needed to be done and knowing that he possessed the skills necessary to do it. Word of Elias's true identity spread through Dead Hollow like wildfire, transforming him overnight from an object of ridicule into something approaching a legend. The Medal of Honor recipient who had walked into their dusty town with nothing but worn boots and a broken spirit was the same man who had held off an entire Apache war party single-handedly, the same soldier whose exploits had been recounted in newspapers across the territory 12 years before. Mrs. Patterson from the general store was among the first to approach him, her face showing the kind of embarrassment that comes with realizing you have misjudged someone completely. "Mr. Boone," she said quietly as he examined supplies in her store, "I want to apologize for the way some folks have been treating you. If we had known who you were, what you had done for this territory—" "Mrs. Patterson," Elias interrupted. Gently, I came here hoping people wouldn't know who I was. The past doesn't change what needs to be done now. But the change in the town's attitude was palpable. Men who had previously ignored him now nodded with respect when he passed. Women, who had whispered about the stranger with the donkey, now spoke to him with the deference reserved for genuine heroes. Even Pete Garrison, whose mockery had provided regular entertainment for his drinking companions, had grown notably quiet whenever Elias appeared. The transformation troubled him more than the original dismissal had. He understood that these people were trying to make amends for their earlier treatment, but their newfound respect was based on actions from another lifetime when he had been a different man, serving in circumstances that no longer existed. What mattered now was not who he had been, but whether he could find the courage to become that man again when Emma's life depended on it. Frank had spent the afternoon in quiet conversation with Marshal Bradley, and by evening it was clear that some kind of decision had been reached. When Elias returned from his final reconnaissance mission with Maisie, he found both men waiting on the front porch with expressions that suggested they had been discussing matters of great importance. "Elias," Frank said without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right. Tom here says that if you're determined to attempt a rescue, he can't officially support it or participate in it, but he won't try to stop you either. He says that sometimes the law has to step aside and let a man do what his conscience tells him is right." Marshal Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about the wisdom of what he was endorsing. "What I said was that I can't authorize a civilian rescue mission into hostile territory, but I also can't arrest a man for trying to save a child's life. If you're determined to do this, I'll give you until dawn before I report your intentions to the territorial authorities." Elias studied both men, understanding that they were offering him something more valuable than official approval. They were giving him permission to act according to his own judgment without the burden of legal consequences or official interference. It was the kind of trust that carried heavy responsibilities and demanded complete honesty in return. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "Both of you, but I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. This is not a rescue mission with good odds of success. This is one man and a donkey attempting something that trained cavalry units would consider suicidal. The chances of bringing Emma back alive are not good, and the chances of my surviving the attempt are even worse." Frank's expression never wavered. "Elias, that little girl is everything to me. She's all the family I have left, all the hope I have for the future. If there's even a remote possibility of saving her, then I don't care how dangerous it is or how slim the odds are. I'm asking you to try, not because I expect you to succeed, but because I can't live with myself if we don't. Make the attempt." The simple honesty of the request hit Elias harder than any amount of pressure or persuasion could have. Frank was not asking him to be a hero or to live up to his reputation. He was asking him to care enough about a frightened little girl to risk everything for her safety, even knowing that the effort might be futile. "All right," Elias said simply. "I'll go." As Marshal Bradley prepared to return to Cedar Creek with promises to delay any official response until the following evening, Elias began his final preparations with the methodical care that had served him well during his military years. He cleaned and checked his Colt 45, a weapon he had not fired in anger since leaving the cavalry, but which remained in perfect condition through years of careful maintenance. The revolver was more than just a tool. It was a tangible connection to the man he had been when survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute confidence in his own abilities. As he loaded fresh cartridges into the cylinder and tested the action one final time, Elias felt something awakening in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. Not the reckless aggression of youth, but the calm determination of a mature man who understood exactly what was at stake and was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect it. His other preparations were equally deliberate. He packed enough Supplies for 3 days in the wilderness, though he expected the mission to be resolved, one way or another, within 24 hours. He included medical supplies in case Emma had been injured, extra ammunition in case the confrontation with Jeb proved more complex than anticipated, and emergency rations in case they were forced to hide in the canyon longer than planned. Most importantly, he spent considerable time with Maisie, checking her tack and equipment, but also preparing her mentally for what they were about to attempt. During their weeks of working together, he had learned to read her moods and reactions, and he could tell that she sensed the unusual tension surrounding their preparations. "Tomorrow's going to be different," he told her as he brushed her coat and examined her hooves one final time. "We're going places that are going to test everything we've learned about trusting each other. I need you to understand that there might be situations where I have to ask you to do things that seem dangerous or foolish." Maisie regarded him with the patient attention she gave to all their serious conversations, her dark eyes holding what he had come to recognize as genuine intelligence. Whether she actually understood the specific meaning of his words was impossible to determine, but her calm acceptance of his preparations suggested that she trusted his judgment regardless of where it might lead them. As full darkness settled over Dead Hollow, Elias made one final journey that he knew was necessary despite the pain it would cause him. On a small rise overlooking the town, beneath a spreading oak tree that reminded him of the one in their ranch yard back in Colorado, he had built a simple cairn of stones to mark Sarah's memory. It was not a grave. Her body lay in the cemetery in Durango, but it was a place where he could come to speak with her when the loneliness became too much to bear. He sat beside the cairn for nearly an hour, telling Sarah about Emma and Frank, about Jeb Blackwood and the choices that had led to this moment. He spoke about his fears and his hopes, about the possibility that he might not survive the next day's mission, and about his growing understanding that some things were worth any risk. "I know you would have loved that little girl," he said finally, his voice barely audible in the night air. "She's got your spirit, your curiosity about the world. And Frank reminds me of your father, stubborn and proud, but with a heart big, enough to love completely despite all the pain life has brought him." The wind stirred the oak leaves above him, creating a soft rustling that might have been Sarah's voice offering encouragement, or might simply have been the natural sounds of a desert evening. Either way, when Elias finally rose and walked back toward town, he carried with him a sense of peace that had been missing from his life since the day Sarah died. Dawn came earlier than expected, bringing with it the crystalline clarity that promised a day of perfect weather for travel. Elias was already loading the last of his supplies onto Maisie when Frank appeared with a thermos of coffee and a bundle of food that would provide nourishment for several days, if necessary. "Emma's doll," Frank said quietly, producing Miss Catherine from beneath his coat. "I thought, if you find her, she'll want this." Elias tucked the ragdoll carefully into his saddlebag, where it would be protected but readily accessible. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, representing not just hope for Emma's rescue, but also faith in his ability to accomplish something that others had dismissed as impossible. As the first light of sunrise painted the eastern ridges in shades of gold and orange, a small crowd began to gather in the street near Frank's house. Word of the rescue attempt had spread despite efforts to keep it secret, and it seemed that everyone in Dead Hollow wanted to witness the departure of the man they now understood to be their only hope for bringing Emma home. Mrs. Patterson was there with her husband, both of them carrying expressions of hopeful anxiety. Doc Henley had come with additional medical supplies and quiet words of encouragement. Even Pete Garrison was present, his face showing a mixture of shame and admiration that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his earlier misjudgments. "Bring her home," Frank said, as Elias mounted Maisie and adjusted his position in the saddle. "Whatever it takes, whatever you have to do, bring my granddaughter home." Elias touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then guided Maisie toward the eastern trail that would take them into country where few civilized men had ever traveled. As they began the long climb toward Devil's Canyon, he was acutely aware of the town watching their departure with a mixture of hope and fear that felt almost like a physical weight on his shoulders. The trail that led toward the canyon was deceptively gentle at first, winding through scrub oak and pine forests that provided pleasant shade and easy traveling. But Elias knew that the real challenges lay ahead, in the maze of rock and stone that had defeated every previous rescue attempt. As they climbed higher into the mountains and Dead Hollow disappeared behind them, Maisie settled into the steady, patient pace that had become her trademark. Her hooves found secure footing on surfaces that would have challenged a mountain goat, and her careful attention to the terrain ahead gave Elias confidence that they were as prepared as possible for what lay ahead. The morning sun climbed higher. As they approached the entrance to Devil's Canyon, and with each step forward, Elias felt the familiar combination of fear and anticipation that had preceded every dangerous mission during his cavalry years. Somewhere ahead, in country that had swallowed previous expeditions without a trace, Emma was waiting for rescue. And somewhere beyond her, Jeb Blackwood was waiting for the confrontation that had been 12 years in the making. The game was about to begin. The entrance to Devil's Canyon opened before them like the mouth of some ancient beast, its towering walls rising hundreds of feet into the morning sky, while shadows pooled in depths that had never seen full sunlight. The main trail disappeared into that darkness, with the confidence of a path that had been traveled by countless horses and men over the years. But Elias guided Maisie away from the obvious route toward terrain that would have challenged even the most experienced mountaineers. The Apache trail he had identified during his reconnaissance was barely visible among the rocks, a series of ledges and natural steps that climbed along the canyon's northern wall at angles that seemed to defy gravity. From below, it would be completely invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. And even knowing of its existence, Elias felt his stomach tighten as he contemplated the climb ahead. "This is it, girl," he told Maisie quietly, as they approached the first section of the trail. "From here on, it's going to test everything we've learned about trusting each other." Maisie studied the narrow ledge that would begin their ascent, her ears pointing forward with the alert attention she gave to particularly challenging terrain. After several minutes of careful consideration, she placed her first hoof on the rock surface, testing its stability before committing her full weight to the precarious footing. The climb that followed was unlike anything Elias had attempted since his cavalry years. The trail, if it could truly be called a trail, consisted of a series of natural ledges and carefully placed stones that formed a path up the canyon wall. In places, it was barely wide enough for Maisie's hooves, with drops of several hundred, feet yawning just inches away from safety. But the donkey moved with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that understood the consequences of carelessness. She placed each step with deliberate precision, pausing frequently to study the route ahead and choose the safest possible path through obstacles that would have defeated most horses. Her patience and careful attention to detail reminded Elias of the Apache scouts who had taught him to navigate impossible terrain, and more than once he found himself grateful for her calm presence in situations that would have been terrifying. With a more excitable mount, 3 hours into their climb, they reached a narrow shelf that provided both rest and concealment while offering a clear view of the canyon floor below. From this vantage point, Elias could see the main trail that conventional rescue attempts would have followed, and he understood immediately why Marshal Bradley had considered the mission hopeless. Anyone approaching through the obvious routes would be visible for miles, exposed to observation and potential ambush from dozens of defensive positions among the rocks above. But more significantly, the elevated position allowed him to spot something that proved his tactical analysis had been correct. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from a location approximately 8 miles into the canyon system, exactly where his knowledge of Jeb's preferences had suggested the outlaw would establish his base camp. It was then that Maisie made a discovery that transformed their mission from difficult to genuinely dangerous. As they rested on the narrow ledge, she began showing signs of agitation that Elias had never seen before. Ears flicking nervously, nostrils flaring as she tested the air for scents that clearly troubled her. Following her gaze, he spotted what had captured her attention: fresh tracks in a patch of dust that had accumulated in a depression between rocks. The tracks were human, but they were recent, made within the past day, possibly within the past few hours. Someone else was using the Apache Trail, someone who knew about the hidden route and was moving along it with the kind of stealth that suggested hostile intentions. Elias dismounted and examined the tracks more carefully, applying skills learned during years of scouting in hostile territory. The pattern of the footprints suggested a man of medium build, moving carefully but confidently. Someone familiar with the terrain who was taking pains to avoid making unnecessary noise. Most tellingly, the tracks were headed in the same direction. He and Maisie were traveling toward the smoke that marked Jeb Blackwood's camp. "Sentry," he whispered to Maisie as he remounted and guided her away from the exposed ledge toward a position that offered better concealment. "Jeb's got someone watching the back approaches." The discovery forced him to reconsider everything about their mission. If Jeb had posted sentries along the Apache Trail, it meant the outlaw leader had anticipated the possibility of an unconventional rescue attempt. More significantly, it suggested that Jeb remembered their shared history well enough to predict how Elias might approach a tactical problem. Moving with even greater caution than before, Elias guided Maisie along a route that paralleled the trail while staying far enough away to avoid detection. The path he chose was more dangerous, a series of narrow ledges and steep climbs that tested both his nerve and Maisie's abilities, but it offered the possibility of reaching their destination without encountering the sentry who was undoubtedly waiting somewhere ahead. As they worked their way deeper into the canyon system, Elias began to notice other signs that Jeb's operation was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. There were carefully concealed observation posts among the rocks, supply caches hidden in locations that would be invisible from the main trail, and evidence of a communication system that would allow sentries to relay warnings throughout the canyon network. The smoke that marked their destination grew closer with each hour of careful climbing, and by mid-afternoon, Elias could make out details of the camp that Jeb had established in the narrow side canyon. Just as he had predicted, the position was nearly perfect from a defensive standpoint, protected by natural barriers that would funnel any conventional attack into killing zones, yet offering multiple escape routes for anyone who knew the terrain well enough to use them. But it was what he saw next that made his blood run cold with a combination of relief and fury. In a small clearing near the center of the camp, a tiny figure in a blue dress was sitting beside a carefully tended fire. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, there was no mistaking Emma's distinctive posture or the way she clutched something tightly against her chest. She was alive. But as Elias studied the camp through his small telescope, he could see that she was also clearly a prisoner. Armed men moved around the perimeter with the casual alertness of professional outlaws, and Emma's position near the fire was chosen to ensure that she would be in the line of fire if anyone attempted a rescue from the obvious approaches. More disturbing was what appeared to be a small object lying in the dust near Emma's feet, something that glinted in the afternoon sunlight with the distinctive shine of polished metal. As Elias adjusted the focus on his telescope and studied the object more carefully, he realized, with growing dread, that it was a hair ribbon, the kind that little girls wore to keep their hair neat and pretty. Emma's hair ribbon, dropped either accidentally or deliberately, lying in the dust where any rescue attempt would find it. A clear message that Jeb Blackwood was expecting company and was prepared to use an 8-year-old girl as both bait and shield in the confrontation that was coming. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the time for action approached, Elias made his final preparations with the calm deliberation of a man who understood that everything depended on the next few hours. Emma was less than a quarter-mile away, but between them lay terrain filled with armed men who would kill her the moment they realized a rescue was being attempted. The game that had begun 12 years ago in an Apache ambush was about to reach its conclusion, and this time there would be no question about who possessed the courage to do what duty demanded. The final approach to Jeb Blackwood's camp required everything Elias had learned about patience and tactical precision during his years with the 4th Cavalry. As shadows lengthened across the canyon floor and the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western ridges, he guided Maisie through a series of movements that would have been impossible with any other animal. Silent passages between boulders, careful descents along surfaces that barely provided footing, and patient waits in concealment while armed sentries passed within yards of their position. Maisie seemed to understand the critical nature of their mission. She moved with a silence that bordered on the supernatural, placing each hoof with the delicate precision of a cat stalking prey. When they needed to remain motionless while voices passed nearby, she stood like a statue carved from stone, not even her breathing audible above the natural sounds of the canyon. From his final observation position, concealed among rocks that overlooked the outlaw camp, Elias could see Emma clearly for the first time since her kidnapping 5 days before. She sat beside the fire with her back straight and her chin raised in a display of courage that reminded him painfully of her grandfather's stubborn dignity. Her blue dress was torn and dirty, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders without the careful braids that Frank always arranged each morning, but her spirit appeared unbroken. More importantly, she was clutching something against her chest with the fierce protectiveness that children reserve for their most precious possessions. Through his telescope, Elias could see that it was not Miss Catherine. The rag doll remained safely tucked in his saddlebag, but rather a small piece of fabric that might have been torn from her dress, or perhaps from the doll itself. Whatever it was, it clearly provided her with comfort in circumstances that would have shattered many adults. The camp itself was arranged exactly as Elias had predicted, based on his knowledge of Jeb's tactical preferences. The outlaws had positioned themselves to control the obvious approaches while maintaining clear lines of retreat toward the canyon's upper reaches. Emma's location near the central fire was chosen to ensure that any conventional rescue attempt would put her in immediate danger, while the surrounding terrain offered multiple defensive positions that would turn any frontal assault into a slaughter. But Elias had not come to attempt a frontal assault. His years with Apache scouts had taught him that the most effective attacks often came from directions that enemies considered impossible, and the route he had chosen would bring him into the camp from an angle that Jeb's defensive preparations had not anticipated. The actual rescue began just as the sun touched the western canyon rim, casting long shadows that would provide crucial concealment for the most dangerous phase of the operation. Elias left Maisie hidden among rocks that offered both protection and a clear escape route, then began his final approach on foot, with the silent movement that had kept him alive during countless scouting missions in hostile territory. The first sentry never knew what hit him. Elias approached from behind with the patience of a man who understood that haste led to mistakes, and when he struck, it was with the swift efficiency of someone trained to neutralize threats without creating unnecessary noise. The outlaw dropped silently, his rifle carefully caught before it could clatter against the rocks and alert his companions. The second sentry proved more challenging, positioned where multiple approaches were visible, and elimination would require crossing exposed ground. But Elias had dealt with similar problems during his cavalry years, and he solved this one with a technique learned from Apache warriors. a carefully thrown stone that created a distraction in one direction while he approached from another. By the time he reached the edge of the main camp, 3 sentries had been neutralized, and the odds had shifted significantly in his favor. But the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning, because from this point forward, any mistake would result in Emma's death and his own capture or killing. It was then that Jeb Blackwood's voice cut through the evening air with the harsh amusement of a man who had been expecting this moment for years. "Well, well," Jeb called out, his words echoing off the canyon walls with deliberate theatricality. "Sergeant Elias Boone of the 4th Cavalry, come to play hero one more time. I was wondering when you'd show up." Elias froze in the shadows between 2 large boulders, realizing that despite his careful approach, Jeb had somehow detected his presence. Through gaps in the rocks, he could see the outlaw leader standing near the fire with his hand resting casually on Emma's shoulder, a gesture that appeared protective but carried an unmistakable threat. "You can come out now, Eli," Jeb continued, using the nickname that had been common during their cavalry years. "No point in hiding among the rocks like some kind of Apache scout. We both know this conversation has been 12 years in the coming." Left with no choice but to reveal himself or watch Emma die, Elias stepped into the firelight with his hands visible but ready to draw his weapon if the opportunity presented itself. The man he faced bore little resemblance to the young soldier he had once trusted with his life. The scar that ran from temple to jaw was new, as were the hard lines around eyes that had once held warmth and humor. "Hello, Jeb," Elias said quietly. "You're looking well for a dead man." "Dead?" Jeb laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, I died that night in the canyon, all right. The man who believed in honor and duty and all those other pretty words they taught us at the academy. He died when his best friend left him to face an Apache war party alone. I never left you, Jeb. You left us." "Did I?" Jeb's grip on Emma's shoulder tightened slightly, causing the little girl to wince, though she made no sound. "Funny. I remember it differently. I remember volunteering to create a diversion that would save wounded soldiers, and I remember my partner questioning my plan instead of supporting it." The conversation continued for several minutes, each man presenting his version of events from that terrible night 12 years before. But Elias was only half listening to Jeb's bitter recriminations. His real attention was focused on studying the camp layout, counting the remaining outlaws, and calculating possibilities for getting Emma to safety. The opportunity came when Jeb's monologue about betrayal and revenge reached its climactic moment. As the outlaw leader drew his weapon to deliver what he clearly intended to be a killing shot, Emma suddenly twisted away from his grip and dove toward the rocks at the edge of the camp. Whether her movement was accidental or deliberate, it created exactly the distraction Elias needed. His Colt 45 cleared leather with the speed that had made him legendary among cavalry units, and his first shot took Jeb in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the darkness beyond the fire. The remaining outlaws scrambled for cover as Elias dove toward Emma's position, scooping her up in one arm while using his free hand to lay down covering fire that kept their enemies pinned behind inadequate shelter. "Hold on tight," he told Emma, as he carried her toward the rocks where Maisie waited. "We're going for a ride that's going to test everything you know about being brave." The escape that followed was a testament to both Maisie's incredible sure-footedness and Emma's remarkable courage. Despite her terror and exhaustion, the little girl clung to Elias with desperate strength while the donkey navigated impossible terrain in near-total darkness, carrying them away from the outlaw camp along routes that pursuing horses could never follow. Behind them, Jeb Blackwood's voice echoed through the canyon, with promises of vengeance that would never be fulfilled. But ahead lay safety and the hope of a reunion that would restore meaning to an old man's life, while proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs most. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern ridges, in shades of gold and rose, when Maisie picked her way down the final slope toward Dead Hollow, carrying two riders who had both been transformed by their journey through Devil's Canyon. Emma rode in front of Elias, wrapped in his coat, and clutching Miss Catherine with the fierce joy of a child reunited with her most precious possession. Despite her exhaustion and the ordeal she had endured, she had insisted on staying awake for the entire return journey, as though she needed to witness every step that carried her closer to home. Elias himself felt the profound weariness that follows moments of extreme danger, but beneath the fatigue was something he had not experienced since Sarah's death, the deep satisfaction that comes from accomplishing something that truly matters. The rescue had tested every skill he possessed and demanded reserves of courage he had not been certain he still possessed, but Emma was alive and safe, and that was all that mattered. As they approached the outskirts of town, Maisie's ears pricked forward with the anticipation of an animal that knew she was returning to familiar territory. She had carried them through impossible terrain for more than 12 hours, navigating by moonlight and instinct through passages that would have defeated the most experienced mountain climbers. Her steady courage and sure-footed reliability had been as crucial to their success as any tactical skill Elias had employed. The town was just beginning to stir when they reached Main Street, but word of their approach spread with the speed that only good news can achieve in a small community. Frank emerged from his house at a run, despite his 72 years, his face showing a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy as he saw his granddaughter safe in Elias's arms. "Emma!" he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Emma, my dear girl." The reunion that followed would be remembered in Dead Hollow for years to come. Emma slid down from Maisie's back and ran to her grandfather with tears streaming down her face, while Frank knelt to catch her in an embrace that seemed to encompass all the love and relief that had been building inside him for 5 terrible days. They held each other without speaking, both of them crying openly, while the growing crowd of townspeople watched with expressions of wonder and gratitude. Mrs. Patterson was among the first to approach Elias as he dismounted from Maisie, her face showing the kind of awe that people reserve for witnessing something they had believed impossible. "Mr. Boone," she said quietly, "what you've done, bringing her back safe when everyone said it couldn't be done, I don't have words to express how grateful we all are." "Maisie did most of the work," Elias replied, running his hand along the donkey's neck with genuine affection. "I just tried to stay out of her way when she was showing me routes that no horse could have managed." Doc Henley appeared with his medical bag, insisting on examining Emma despite her obvious vigor and Frank's reluctance to let her out of his arms. The examination revealed nothing more serious than exhaustion, dehydration, and a few minor cuts and bruises, remarkable considering what she had endured during her captivity and rescue. "She's resilient," Doc Henley announced to the assembled crowd. "A few good meals and some proper rest, and she'll be back to her old self." He paused, studying Emma's face with professional interest. "Though I suspect this young lady has learned some things about her own strength that will serve her well in the years to come." As the morning progressed and the full story of the rescue spread throughout Dead Hollow, the transformation in how the townspeople viewed Elias became complete. Men who had once mocked his partnership with Maisie now spoke of him with the respect reserved for genuine heroes. Women who had whispered about his circumstances now brought food and offers of assistance. Even Pete Garrison approached him with an apology that showed genuine remorse for his earlier behavior. "Mr. Boone," Pete said, his usual swagger replaced by an awkward humility, "I want you to know how sorry I am for the things I said about you and your donkey. We all misjudged you something terrible, and what you did last night, well, it puts us all to shame." "No need for apologies, Pete," Elias replied, with the gracious acceptance of a man who understood that people could change when circumstances demanded it. "We all make mistakes about each other. The important thing is that Emma's safe." But the Most significant moment came when Frank approached him in the early afternoon, carrying something wrapped in cloth that had clearly been prepared with great care. "Elias," the old rancher said formally, "I want you to have this. It's not much, but it's the best way I know to show my gratitude for what you've done." Inside the cloth wrapping was a brand new saddle designed specifically for Maisie, hand-tooled leather worked with patterns that spoke of hours of careful craftsmanship, fitted with silver conchos that caught the afternoon sunlight like stars. It was the kind of tack that marked the partnership between a working animal and someone who valued her contributions beyond mere utility. "Frank," Elias said, genuinely moved by the gesture, "this is too much. I can't accept something this valuable." "You can and you will," Frank replied with the stubborn determination that Emma had inherited from him. "That donkey of yours earned this with every step she took through Devil's Canyon, and you earned the right to put it on her back. Besides," he added with a smile that transformed his weathered features, "I need to make sure you two are properly equipped for all the work you're going to be doing around here." The implication was clear, and it brought Elias a sense of belonging that he had not expected to find again after losing Sarah and the ranch in Colorado. Dead Hollow was offering him more than just employment. They were offering him a place in their community, a chance to be useful and valued for the contributions he could make, rather than pitied for the losses he had suffered. As evening approached and the town settled into the comfortable rhythms of ordinary life, Elias found himself sitting on Frank's front porch with Emma curled up beside him, listening to her recount her adventure with the mixture of excitement and lingering fear that children bring to retelling traumatic experiences. She had asked for Miss Catherine immediately upon arriving home, and now the rag doll sat in her lap while she described how she had remembered her grandfather's stories about being brave, even when you were scared. "The scary man said nobody would come for me," she told Elias, with the earnest intensity of a child sharing important information. "He said I was too far away and the rocks were too dangerous. But I knew Grandpa Frank would find a way, because he promised he would always take care of me." "Your grandfather's a man who keeps his promises," Elias agreed, glancing toward Frank, who was listening from his rocking chair with tears in his eyes. "And you came with Maisie," Emma continued, reaching over to pat the donkey, who was grazing contentedly in the front yard. "The scary man didn't think anybody could climb those rocks, but Maisie knew how to do it. She's the smartest donkey in the whole world." As full darkness settled over Dead Hollow and the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Elias reflected on the journey that had brought him from a broken-down ranch in Colorado to a dusty frontier town where he had found purpose again. The road had been harder than anything he could have imagined, marked by losses that had seemed unbearable and challenges that had tested his faith in his own worth. But sitting here with Emma safe beside him and Frank's gratitude warming the evening air, while Maisie grazed peacefully in the starlight and the town settled into sleep around them, Elias understood that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us home to places we never expected to belong. Sarah would have loved this moment, he realized, would have delighted in Emma's resilience and Frank's stubborn devotion, would have appreciated the quiet heroism of a donkey who had proven that courage comes in all sizes and shapes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new chances to be useful and valued in a community that had learned to see past appearances to the character beneath. But tonight, as he listened to Emma's sleepy voice describing her adventure and felt the contentment that comes from knowing you have done something that truly matters, Elias Boone was exactly where he needed to be. The mockery had turned to respect. The broken cowboy had found his purpose, and the old donkey had proven that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships accomplish the most extraordinary things. In Dead Hollow, where legends were born from the simplest acts of courage, a man and his donkey had written a story that would be remembered for generations to come.